our lives is totally ruled by the laws of the Torah, and when we as the changing in time, we adhere. We try to see that we should adhere to the rules of the Torah, even in the changing of times, no matter what happens. Zionism is a movement of 150 years or so. It's a political movement. It was a movement of Jews who were estranged from the Torah. And just to give you a little more to understand, before Zionism came, it was like 250, 300 years ago, there was the movement called Reform Judaism. Reform, which is the majority, unfortunately, today, Jews are non-religious. They're not Orthodox, what they call. They do not adhere to the rules of the Torah. And what they made, their first claims were, when they started their movement, is, oh, Moses made the Torah, so it's not from God. Even though there was never a gap in our history. We're talking over 1 million people. We're people of the book. People wrote books and constantly, and nobody challenged or said that it wasn't true. The fact that we saw God speaking to us, that we heard God say, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am your God, and that the Torah was given to Moses from God and that was passed down from generation. There was never a gap. Yet this reform movement started from Moses Mendelssohn. His name should be obliterated. He was the beginning of reform. And he said, we're going to reform because you can pick and choose and do what you want, whatever's convenient, because it's not from God. Anyway, that's how reform started. And the reform was exactly what they say they're going to reform. You can't reform God's word, but they just don't believe it's God's word. Yet they want, in order to give themselves legitimacy, they ordained ministers, what they call rabbis. They made things that's similar to synagogues, but it's also similar to the church. They made the temples. They changed the garb of how the people pray. They put an organ that plays on the Sabbath, which is forbidden for us. And they don't keep the Sabbath. They don't respect the laws of the Sabbath. They don't respect the laws of kosher. All these commands doesn't mean anything by them. They pick what is convenient. Why? They are trying to assimilate. They want to be able. They said they wanted to fit into society where they were living and to be respected instead of being scorned as Jews. And it became very popular, unfortunately. And in order, like I say, that should be accepted, they made it like they're ordaining ministers. So all of a sudden, they became rabbis, even though they're lacking the knowledge of the Torah, and they're certainly not practicing the laws of the Torah. And they gave it a form of legitimacy. And it became, unfortunately, spread like fire. And the majority of the people today are not Orthodox. They don't keep the 10 Commandments, even the Sabbath. So that's basically it. From them, their children and grandchildren, like the generation 2 later, were these Zionists. These were people already who were non-practicing as a whole, and they didn't practice the laws, and they had nothing. And they weren't happy with this assimilation project of trying to assimilate, because they said, we still see that the non-Jews sometimes will get drunk or something and say, you dirty Jew, and it wouldn't help the fact that they were trying to just be the same like their non-Jewish neighbors. So that was one of the excuses. They said that they wanted to create a Jewish state, their own homeland, and that way they'll protect themselves with guns and so forth. Now, this whole concept of Zionism could only come out of a non-religious concept, because God warned us. First, he took us out of Egypt. We accepted the Torah 3,000 years ago, and we were told to go into the Holy Land. We went in through miracles. The walls of Jericho sunk. We walked around there, and so it was God's miracle. But God told us we have to be on a very high level of holiness in order to remain as a nation there. And he required of us to build a temple. And Solomon built a temple. Then there was a second temple later. But basically, it was on a condition that we should be on a very high level of spirituality and holiness. If we don't remain on that high level of spirituality, then we were warned by God that we will be sent from the land, we will be exiled from the land, and that came about 2,000 years ago. That's been a period of 1,000 years we had there, the whole land. And then we were dispersed amongst the nations with the destruction of the temple. And we were warned by God through a prophecy of King Solomon that we are forbidden to attempt to return en masse, in large numbers, or to try to end exile in any shape or form. And we should not rebel against any nation. So we have 3 prohibitions: not to rebel against nations, not to return en masse, not to attempt to end exile. That's a stringent command of the Almighty, and that's 2,000 years ago. And since then was dispersed amongst the nations, and we suffered Inquisition, that they tried to forcibly convert Jews to Christianity in Europe, and many other trials and tribulations. But we never, our communities never attempted to reestablish a Jewish sovereignty. Why? Because we were warned by God. We are in exile. God is compassionate. He's the ruler of the world. When he sees our suffering, when he feels the time is right, he will end exile, at which time we believe there'll be a metaphysical change in the world. All humanity will recognize one God, not become Jewish, but everybody will believe in one God. They'll stop being atheists. God will then bring us back together, and God himself, the Almighty himself, will build the temple. That's what we believe. So we'll be without any human intervention. The whole concept will be a miraculous change in the world. That is the Jewish belief, and we yearn and pray for that closeness to God that we're lacking now. We yearn and pray for the return to the Holy Land, yes, but not on a manner of taking a gun and returning. It's when God, with his compassion, will end this whole worldly concept the way it is today with a metaphysical change. That's Judaism. Zionism came along, and these were already children of non-practicing Jews, and they came along and said, you know, enough of this even assimilation, and they're not religious anyway. They're going to come, they're going to make their own state. So the rabbis who were there, of course, said to them, you guys, you can't do this. You can't make your own state. It's forbidden. It's expressly forbidden for Jews. But they laughed. And who are you to say? Well, they didn't look at the rabbis with any respect or anything. They was a group of non-practicing Jews rebelling against God. Some of them didn't even believe in God, or maybe a lot of them didn't believe in God. So this whole concept was a transformation of from Judaism, which means subservience to God, which we strictly had practiced for 3,000 years, into an ersatz Judaism, a nationalism. Now they wanted to make their homeland, these Zionists, in Patagonia and Uganda, different places, because they were looking for a practical place that they should have a lush land, and it should, because it was before the time of technology. So they wanted to have a land that should be productive, and they should be able to create a beautiful country. But then they realized, they had a meeting in Basel, Switzerland, in the 1890s, where they said, look, we can't, in order to establish a country, you need the backing of the world, people, or the world powers, and you need a massive amount of support. So they decided, it would be more practical to go to Palestine, although Palestine was not such a lush land. But at the same time, they will be able to piggyback and use the facts that Jews are called the children of Israel, that God gave us the land, and they'll be able to have a narrative and tell the world, hey, you should support us because we're the people of the book, the children of Israel, returning to the land of Israel that God promised us. And the evangelistic Christians, that fits like hand in glove. That's exactly what they want to hear. And they're very happy to support such a thing. So they have millions and millions of Christians who support this concept of Jews returning to the Holy Land. So they realize they can get support. And also, unfortunately, the majority of Jews already were non-religious, and they can turn to them and counting on their ignorance in the Jewish law and laying on their emotions. They can say, hey, every Jew says in his prayers in the Passover Seder that we say the coming year in Jerusalem, the coming year in Jerusalem. So they'll use these concepts, and they can say, hey, we're returning to Jerusalem, just like God told us. With the beginning of redemption, they use the concept, with the beginning of God's redemption. Even though the ones who were knowledgeable amongst them knew clearly and very well understood and knew that according to the Torah, we're expressly forbidden to return. And it's not God's redemption. We are supposed to be living throughout the world as loyal citizens in every country we reside, praying for the well-being of the country we are. It's a requirement of Judaism. But they didn't care. So Zionism is a transformation from subservience to God to base material nationalism. And on the contrary, they take God out of the equation because they ignore the fact that we're not allowed to, in fact, make our own, even 1 centimeter, 1 inch of Jewish sovereignty is forbidden since the destruction. But that's God's will, that we should be humbled, we should be subservient and realize we're in exile, and that will cause us to be closer to God and pray and ask for God's compassion. So doing what they're doing is a direct rebellion against God. It's rooted in blasphemy because their whole concept is like they claim, one of the reasons they claim, actually it's the Satan is driving them to make this state. What do they need it for? They should just stop. They're not Jews practicing Jews anyway, so just do your thing in whatever land you're living. No, but they insist on making this country that they call a Jewish state, and they used it because to be able to sell it to the Christians and so forth. So they use the Star of David, they call it Israel, which is Jacob. But when you ask them, why do you need this? So they say, what do you mean why we need it? Don't you see how much we suffered throughout the history in Europe? So we say, look, we believe in God. Everything is from God. God is compassionate. A tsunami comes from God. An earthquake, a plague, and all the good that comes everything is from God. We turn to God. We look at God to protect us. So you say, you're looking to God to protect you? Where was God? So they spew blasphemy, heresy, and they scorn us, and they laugh at the religious Jew. They say, yeah, you're looking at God. The solution is to take a gun and make your own state and protect yourself. So, and then of course they try to embellish it and use conflate Judaism with it to come, that it should look kosher, it should look good, and they use the facade and they masquerade in the Israel, Star of David, the menorah, all these different things. But the underlying issue is that they scorn and laugh at that religious Jew who looks to God to protect them and says only the Almighty can protect us and is the protector. And so it's rooted in that. Then, unfortunately, being that they made their state in Palestine, so now we have another issue. Because if it would have been a desolate land and uninhabited, we still would oppose them because we're in exile and we're forbidden to return en masse and make our own country. As individuals, God permitted us to live there under the Ottoman Empire, whoever it may be, as long they gave us permission to live there, these countries, so we can. The Torah permits us. But to go en masse and make a national home, that's forbidden.